Big Shaq stepped into the music room, and instantly the laughter died. Mr. Lancaster, the smug music teacher, had just forced Aaliyah, the only black student, to play the piano in front of the entire class, expecting to humiliate her. The students whispered, exchanging amused glances, waiting for her to fail, until a shadow loomed over the doorway. "You really think this is funny?" Shaq's deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. Lancaster smirked, unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. What happened next would shake the entire school to its core. Stay till the end, because this lesson, it's one he'll never forget. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The classroom was filled with soft murmurs and the occasional sound of someone tapping their pencil against a desk. The grand piano sat untouched in the middle of the room, its polished surface reflecting the bright classroom lights. Mr. Lancaster, the tall, gray-haired music teacher with sharp, judgmental eyes, paced near the piano, scanning the room like a hunter looking for prey. His gaze settled on Aaliyah. Aaliyah sat in the back corner, her fingers gently tapping against the edge of her desk, an unconscious habit she had whenever she was deep in thought. Her brown eyes stayed lowered, avoiding the judgmental stares of her classmates. Most of them came from wealthy families, kids who had taken private music lessons since they were 5. Aaliyah, however, had never had a formal teacher. She learned to play by ear, spending hours at the community center piano, letting her fingers find melodies on their own. Mr. Lancaster's voice cut through the classroom. "Aaliyah," he said with an exaggerated politeness that sent a chill down her spine. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" The room fell silent. Then a few hushed giggles rippled through the students. Aaliyah stiffened. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about giving her a fair chance. This was about humiliating her. Mr. Lancaster had never once called on her before, not in all the months she had been in this class. He only ever praised his star students, the ones whose parents donated to the school's music program. Aaliyah lifted her head slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. I didn't bring any sheet music." Mr. Lancaster's smirk widened. "Oh, that's fine. I'm sure someone with real talent doesn't need sheet music." The snickering grew louder. Someone whispered, "This is gonna be embarrassing." Aaliyah swallowed the lump in her throat. She could feel her hands trembling slightly, but she wasn't sure if it was anger or nerves. She wanted to prove them wrong. She wanted to show them she wasn't some charity case. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She stepped toward the piano, her fingers already itching to touch the keys. But before she could sit down, a deep, commanding voice rumbled from the doorway. "You really think this is funny?" The entire classroom turned toward the door. Big Shaq stood there, arms crossed, his towering frame filling the entrance. His sharp eyes locked onto Mr. Lancaster, and the smirk instantly disappeared from the teacher's face. The room went dead silent. Mr. Lancaster let out a low chuckle, adjusting the cuffs of his pressed shirt as he turned toward the massive figure blocking the doorway. His smirk barely wavered as he sized up Shaq, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, like a man who just realized he had poked a sleeping bear. "Oh?" Lancaster said, his voice carrying an exaggerated air of amusement. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" The students exchanged glances, a few of them whispering amongst themselves. Everyone in that room knew exactly who Shaq was, but Lancaster pretended not to. A power move, an attempt to belittle him. Shaq didn't blink. He took a slow step forward, the floor creaking under his weight, his presence swallowing the space between them. The tension thickened like a storm cloud rolling in. "I'm someone who doesn't tolerate bullies," Shaq said, his voice steady, firm. Lancaster let out another scoff, crossing his arms. "A bully? Oh, come now. I'm a teacher. I educate. This is a lesson in humility." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Nah," he said. "You're just scared she might be better than your favorites." A hush fell over the room. The students glanced at each other, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even they could tell that Lancaster had no real defense. Lancaster's jaw tightened for half a second, but then he plastered on another condescending smile. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "I simply want to see what she can do. If she's got talent, let her prove it." Shaq didn't look at him. He turned his attention to Aaliyah, who was still standing stiffly by the piano, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been humiliated, called out as if she were nothing but a joke. "Go ahead, Aaliyah," Shaq said, his voice softer now but still commanding. "Show them!" Aaliyah swallowed, her throat dry. She could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes on her, some waiting for her to fail, some hoping she wouldn't. She hesitated for only a second longer before finally taking a seat at the piano bench. The polished keys gleamed under the classroom lights. She inhaled deeply, pressing her fingers lightly against the keys. Mr. Lancaster smirked, arms still folded, as if he were already prepared to mock whatever happened next. But Shaq? Shaq just smiled. Aaliyah exhaled, steadied herself. And then she began to play. Aaliyah closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as her fingers hovered over the piano keys. The classroom was suffocatingly silent, but she could still feel the weight of every stare pressing down on her. Mr. Lancaster stood off to the side, arms crossed, that smug smirk still curling on his lips like he was already preparing his next insult. But then, she pressed down on the first key. A single delicate note rang through the room, then another, and another. Her fingers danced across the keys, effortlessly gliding from one note to the next. What started as a simple melody quickly bloomed into something far greater, something alive, something powerful, a song that didn't just fill the room, it took over. The students, who had been waiting for her to embarrass herself, stiffened. Their whispers died out, replaced by something far rarer in that classroom: awe. The music swelled, cascading into rich, intricate chords that poured out of her, as if the piano itself was an extension of her soul. Her hands moved with absolute confidence, weaving a story through sound, one of resilience, of defiance, of pure, undeniable talent. Shaq, standing tall by the door, folded his arms and smirked. "Didn't see that coming, huh?" Mr. Lancaster's face had drained of color. His smirk had vanished, replaced by something Aaliyah had never seen before: shock. This wasn't a shaky, nervous attempt by an unskilled student. This wasn't a mistake-ridden performance Lancaster could easily tear apart. This was masterful. This was better than anything his so-called star pupils had ever played. The once snide students now leaned forward in their seats, eyes locked on Aaliyah in disbelief. Some of them had spent years training under Lancaster, being told they were the best. But now they were watching as a girl they had mocked, one their teacher had tried to humiliate, effortlessly outshone them all. Aaliyah didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Every note was crisp, every transition seamless. She didn't just play the music, she owned it. By the time she hit the final chord, her chest rising and falling from the intensity of it all, there was nothing but silence. A thick, stunned, undeniable silence. Then, clap. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the room. It was Shaq. And then, one by one, the students joined in. The slow clap became a ripple, then a wave, and then a full-blown standing ovation. Mr. Lancaster stood frozen, jaw clenched, fists tightening at his sides, because in that moment, he knew he had just lost. Mr. Lancaster's fingers twitched as the applause roared around him. His smug expression had long since vanished, replaced by something colder, something bitter. He glanced at his prize students, but they weren't looking at him for approval anymore. Their eyes were fixed on Aaliyah, still seated at the piano, her hands trembling slightly from the rush of emotion. He cleared his throat sharply, cutting through the lingering applause like a blade. All right, he said, forcing a thin smile. That was adequate." The clapping faltered. Students exchanged confused glances, their excitement dimming under the weight of Lancaster's dismissive tone. Shaq's expression darkened. His massive frame remained still, but the tension in the air shifted immediately. "Adequate?" His voice was low, measured, dangerous. Lancaster turned to face him, lifting his chin in defiance. "Yes, adequate," he repeated, regaining some of his confidence. "This class isn't just about playing notes. It's about discipline, respect, and quite frankly, Aaliyah's performance, while passable, lacked refinement." A murmur rippled through the students. Even those who had snickered at Aaliyah earlier were now whispering amongst themselves, their loyalty to Lancaster visibly shaken. One student, a girl who had always been one of Lancaster's favorites, hesitated before speaking. "That was better than any of us," she admitted, barely above a whisper. Lancaster's jaw tightened. "Music isn't just about raw talent," he snapped, his voice sharper now. "It's about control, technique, and years of dedicated training. A single performance doesn't prove anything." Shaq took a step forward. The room suddenly felt smaller. "So, let me get this straight," he said slowly, his deep voice carrying across the classroom. "You put her on the spot, expecting her to fail, and when she didn't, you moved the goalpost?" Lancaster scoffed. "I expect all my students to hold themselves to the highest standard." Shaq tilted his head, studying him. "Nah, you expected her to fail because it makes you feel powerful," he said, his voice unwavering. A visible shudder went through Lancaster, but he forced out a dismissive chuckle. "You don't understand how things work in an academic environment. This isn't the basketball court. Here we—" Shaq cut him off with a short laugh of his own, though there was no humor in it. "Respect? You want to talk about respect?" He took another step forward, his towering presence making Lancaster visibly stiffen. Aaliyah, still seated at the piano, looked between them. For the first time since entering that room, she didn't feel small. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Oh, we're about to see who really deserves respect." Mr. Lancaster watched Shaq walk out of the room, his lips curling into a smug smirk. Finally, the so-called basketball legend had given up. Good. He had no business interfering in an academic setting. This was his classroom, his authority, and no washed-up athlete was going to tell him how to run it. The tension in the room slowly started to dissipate. Some students exchanged uncertain glances, while others resumed their casual whispering. Aaliyah, however, sat frozen at the piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. The glow of victory she'd felt only moments ago had faded, replaced by the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. Maybe she had impressed them for a moment, but in the end, it didn't matter. People like Lancaster always found a way to belittle people like her. Mr. Lancaster clapped his hands together. "All right, enough distractions. Let's get back to our lesson." He turned toward the whiteboard, scribbling down notes on classical composers, pretending the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. But just as he started speaking, the door swung open again. The entire class turned as Shaq stepped back inside. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just calm, he was smiling. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face as he casually leaned against the doorframe, his phone still in his hand. Mr. Lancaster narrowed his eyes. "You're still here?" Shaq let out a short chuckle. "Yeah." He slipped his phone into his pocket, folding his arms over his massive chest. "And so are some very important people." The room fell into an eerie silence. Mr. Lancaster's smirk faltered. "What do you mean?" Shaq pushed off the doorframe and took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Oh, you'll see." Before Lancaster could press further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. Then, voices, multiple voices, serious, authoritative tones. A moment later, the principal stormed in, followed by a group of sharply dressed individuals, executives in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, a woman stepped in, her presence commanding instant respect. Her sleek black blazer, poised stance, and piercing gaze made it clear. She wasn't just someone, she was someone important. The students sat up straighter. A few of them whispered, their curiosity growing. The principal cleared his throat. "Mr. Lancaster, it seems we have some unexpected guests." The teacher swallowed, gripping the marker in his hand a little tighter. "And who might they be?" The woman at the front finally spoke. Her voice was sharp, controlled. "We're from the National Music Conservatory." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Mr. Lancaster paled. Shaq just smiled. "Yeah," he said smoothly. "I made a few calls." The air in the classroom shifted the moment the door swung open. Footsteps echoed against the polished floors, growing louder with every second. Mr. Lancaster turned his head, his brow furrowing as a group of sharply dressed individuals strode into the room. Their expensive suits, purposeful movements, and unreadable expressions sent a ripple of tension through the students. Leading them was a tall, middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair, his posture commanding instant authority. At his side, a woman in a deep blue blazer adjusted the strap of her sleek leather bag, her keen eyes scanning the room as if she were assessing every detail. Behind them, the principal rushed in, clearly out of breath. His tie was slightly askew, his forehead glistening under the bright fluorescent lights. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice laced with confusion. Shaq, still standing casually near the piano, folded his arms over his broad chest and smirked. "Oh, just thought I'd invite some people who actually know talent," he said smoothly. Lancaster's face twitched. His grip on the marker in his hand tightened, his knuckles going white. "And who exactly are these guests?" he asked, his voice forcibly even. The man with silver-streaked hair stepped forward, giving a polite but firm nod. My name is Victor Hanover, he introduced himself, his voice deep and measured. I'm the director of the National Music Conservatory. A collective gasp spread through the students. Whispers broke out. Wait, that National Music Conservatory? A girl in the front row muttered. The one that only accepts the top musicians in the country? Another boy whispered. Even the more privileged students, the ones Lancaster usually favored, straightened in their seats, their faces a mixture of awe and anxiety. The teacher, however, stood frozen in place. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The woman in the blue blazer finally spoke. We're here because we heard there might be an exceptional talent at this school. Her sharp gaze flickered to Aaliyah, who still sat at the piano, looking both stunned and unsure of what was happening. Mr. Lancaster let out a short, breathy laugh, clearly trying to regain his composure. Oh well, he stammered, we have many talented students here. Perhaps I could arrange a proper demonstration. Victor Hanover raised a hand, cutting him off. No need, he said simply. His gaze turned back to Aaliyah. We're here to see her. Lancaster stiffened, his face draining of color. Wait, he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. What? The low hum of chattering students filled the vast auditorium as the entire school gathered, their seats packed from the front row to the balcony. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and nervous excitement sweeping through the crowd. Whispers rippled across the room as eyes darted between the grand stage and the group of prestigious judges seated in the front row. At the center of the stage, the principal stood tall behind the wooden podium, his hands gripping the edges as he cleared his throat into the microphone. The murmurs in the auditorium died down instantly. Students, he began, his voice steady, yet laced with the weight of the moment. It is my great honor to introduce a group of very distinguished guests who have come here today for a rather special occasion. Aaliyah sat near the stage, her hands clenched together on her lap, heart pounding against her ribcage. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it consume her. Mr. Lancaster stood off to the side, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. His usual air of authority was slipping, his expression carefully masking the storm brewing beneath. The principal continued. As many of you know, the National Music Conservatory is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Only the best of the best are accepted, and today we are privileged to have their selection committee right here in our very school. Gasps and excited murmurs erupted throughout the audience. Some students gawked at the judges in their crisp suits. Others sat up straighter, as if hoping to somehow be noticed. Victor Hanover, the conservatory director, leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he scanned the students before him. We are not here simply to observe, he announced. His deep, authoritative voice carried effortlessly across the auditorium. We are here to offer a life-changing opportunity. Silence fell. We will be selecting one student, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the sea of young musicians. One student who has demonstrated undeniable talent, passion, and potential will receive a full scholarship to our institution. The weight of his words sank in. Eyes widened. Students exchanged glances, some hopeful, others panicked. But no one looked more unsettled than Mr. Lancaster. His face burned red as the realization set in. He no longer controlled this narrative. Victor's gaze finally landed on Aaliyah. We've already seen someone who has impressed us. Lancaster took a half step forward, his mouth opening to object. But before he could speak, a deep, steady voice cut through the tension like a knife. Shaq, standing at the side of the stage with his arms folded, smirked. So, he said, tilting his head, you still think she doesn't belong? The tension in the auditorium was thick enough to cut with a knife. The room had settled into an eerie silence, every student and teacher watching as the prestigious judges took their seats. Mr. Lancaster, despite the sweat forming at his brow, wasn't ready to go down without a fight. His mind worked fast, grasping for control. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward with forced confidence. Before we make any hasty decisions, he said, flashing a tight-lipped smile, I believe we should showcase all of our talent. His voice dripped with feigned professionalism, but everyone could see the desperation in his eyes. I'd like to present our school's top pianist, Nathan Wellington. A smug-looking student in an expensive suit strode onto the stage. His golden hair was slicked back, his posture flawless. Nathan had always been Lancaster's prize student, the one he paraded in competitions, the one he knew would make him look good. Nathan took a seat at the grand piano, flexed his fingers, and began playing. The notes were crisp, technically flawless. His fingers moved with precision, his posture impeccable. It was an impressive display of skill. Years of formal training were evident in every movement. But something was missing. The music, though polished, felt hollow. There was no soul, no passion, just robotic perfection. The audience listened respectfully, but no one was moved. The judges exchanged glances. Victor Hanover, the lead judge, leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression remained unreadable, but the lack of enthusiasm was telling. Nathan finished with a dramatic flourish, lifting his chin as if he had already won. A polite smattering of applause followed, but nothing more. Mr. Lancaster, sensing the lukewarm reaction, was quick to intervene. He turned abruptly to Aaliyah, his smile tightening. "Aaliyah," he said smoothly, "perhaps it's best if you sit this one out. I wouldn't want to put you under too much pressure." Aaliyah's heart clenched. This was it. He was trying to push her aside, again. Before she could find her voice, a shadow loomed over Lancaster. "Nah." Shaq's deep voice reverberated through the auditorium like thunder. "She's playing." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Lancaster's jaw twitched, his lips parted, ready to argue. But when he met Shaq's unwavering gaze, steady, powerful, unchallenged, he hesitated. Aaliyah felt the warmth of Shaq's silent support, the unspoken belief he had in her. Slowly she rose from her seat. She walked toward the piano, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve was solid. As she placed her fingers on the keys, Lancaster's face twisted into an ugly scowl. He knew. He had already lost. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her fingers resting lightly on the piano keys. The weight of every mocking laugh, every dismissive glance, and every unfair moment she had endured in this class pressed against her chest. But as she exhaled, all of it melted away. This moment was hers. She closed her eyes and pressed the first note. A single haunting sound filled the auditorium, soft yet powerful. It lingered in the air, commanding silence. Then her fingers moved fluidly across the keys, the melody unfolding like a story only she could tell. The song wasn't just being played, it was being felt. The audience was frozen, hanging onto every note. The music swelled, rising like a tidal wave, then dipped into delicate, whisper-like tones. The judges, who had maintained neutral expressions throughout the competition, suddenly leaned in, their brows lifting in astonishment. Shaq crossed his arms, a proud grin creeping onto his face. "There it is," he muttered. Mr. Lancaster, standing stiffly at the edge of the stage, clenched his fists. His prize student, Nathan, had played flawlessly, yet no one had reacted like this. No one had been moved, but now they were. Even the students who had once laughed at Aaliyah sat spellbound. A few of them exchanged wide-eyed glances, realizing the truth. She was better than all of them. The melody reached its peak, a breathtaking cascade of notes flowing effortlessly. Aaliyah's fingers flew, each stroke of the keys filled with emotion. Years of unspoken words, of being underestimated, of waiting for her chance. And now, she owned this moment. As the final note rang out, the sound lingered, fading into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire auditorium sat in stunned quiet, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Then, Shaq clapped. Once, twice. The sound echoed, cutting through the silence. Then another clap, and another. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. Students jumped to their feet, applauding, cheering. The judges, who had remained composed all evening, stood up, nodding in appreciation. The lead judge turned to the others, and they exchanged knowing looks. Aaliyah sat still, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled them from the keys. Was this real? Had she actually done it? Shaq leaned down and whispered, "Told you. They were never ready for you." Mr. Lancaster stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if struggling to form words. The lead judge took a step forward, raising his hand for silence. Everyone stilled, waiting for his verdict. The tension in the air was electric. Then he smiled. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice carrying through the auditorium, "that was extraordinary." The crowd roared again, but Lancaster's face twisted in horror. He knew what was coming next. The applause still thundered through the auditorium, As Aaliyah stood beside the grand piano, her chest rising and falling with disbelief, the judges had risen to their feet, an honor rarely given, and one by one they approached her. The lead judge extended his hand, his expression one of deep admiration. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "your talent is undeniable. We would be honored to offer you a full scholarship to the National Music Conservatory." Gasps rippled through the room. The same students who had laughed at her now stared in shock. Aaliyah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Wait, really?" The judge chuckled. "You earned it." Before she could respond, Shaq clapped a firm hand on her shoulder. "Told you," he said with a wink. "They weren't ready for you." Across the stage, Mr. Lancaster stood rigid, his face a storm of frustration. His entire scheme, to humiliate her, to prove she didn't belong, had crumbled before his eyes. Instead of failure, she had achieved something none of his hand-picked favorites had. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." Shaq turned sharply, his smirk widening. "Oh, we're not done yet." The room quieted. Lancaster's eyes darted to the judges, the principal, the students, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one spoke. The weight of his actions was settling in. The principal, a stern man who had remained silent during the performance, finally took a step forward. His gaze locked onto Lancaster, and his expression darkened. "Mr. Lancaster," he said firmly, "please step into my office." Lancaster's entire body tensed. "What? But I—" "Now!" A hush fell over the room. Students exchanged glances, sensing something much bigger at play. Shaq folded his arms, his towering presence making Lancaster shrink even further. "I'd go if I were you," he said, his voice low but full of authority. "Trust me, this conversation isn't one you want to have in front of all these people." Lancaster swallowed hard, his face drained of color. The once arrogant teacher, who had spent years tearing students down, was now the one being summoned like a misbehaving child. With stiff movements, he turned and walked toward the exit, but not before throwing Aaliyah one last glare. She didn't flinch. She was no longer afraid of him. As Lancaster disappeared through the doors, the entire school buzzed with whispers. "What's going to happen to him?" He looked scared. Shaq leaned toward Aaliyah and grinned. "Something tells me he won't be coming back." Mr. Lancaster sat stiffly in the principal's office, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air was thick with tension, the walls seeming to close in on him as the principal, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes, shuffled through a folder of documents. Across from him, Shaq leaned casually against the bookshelf, arms crossed, his towering frame making the room feel even smaller. Aaliyah sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, no longer the timid girl she had been just hours ago. The principal exhaled sharply, setting the folder down with deliberate force. "Mr. Lancaster," he began, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Do you have any idea how many complaints we've received about you over the years?" Lancaster's mouth opened, then closed. He cleared his throat. "Complaints?" he scoffed, attempting to keep his composure. "I run a strict class, Principal Warner. I have high standards." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "High standards?" He pushed off the bookshelf and took a step closer, looming over Lancaster like a shadow. "Nah, man. You don't have standards. You have a problem." The principal nodded, flipping open the folder again. "You've been accused of singling out students, disproportionately punishing minority students, and—" He paused, glancing at a particular page, his brow furrowing. "Denying talented students opportunities based on your own personal biases." Lancaster's face turned red. "That's absurd. I was simply upholding the integrity of this institution." Shaq took another step forward, his voice lower now. "Dangerous. You were trying to break a girl's spirit. And for what? Because she didn't fit your idea of what a pianist should look like?" Aaliyah lifted her chin, her voice soft but steady. "You never even gave me a chance." The silence that followed was deafening. Principal Warner steepled his fingers, fixing Lancaster with a hard stare. "You know," he said slowly, "this isn't the first time we've had to sit you down for this. The school board was already looking into your conduct. But now?" He tapped the folder. "Now we have witnesses. We have video evidence." Lancaster's head snapped up. "Video?" Shaq grinned, pulling out his phone. "Oh yeah, turns out students these days record everything." He turned the screen toward Lancaster, pressing play. The teacher's own smug voice filled the office. "Aaliyah, Why don't you show us what you've got? The mockery in his tone was undeniable. Then came the laughter, the snide remarks, the look of triumph on his face, until Aaliyah started playing. Lancaster's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. This is being taken out of context. You humiliated a student, the principal interrupted, his voice sharp. You tried to strip her of her dignity, and when she proved you wrong, you still refused to acknowledge her talent. He shook his head in disgust. That is not the kind of educator we want in this institution. Lancaster shot up from his chair, his voice rising. This is outrageous. You're going to ruin my career over this? Shaq stepped even closer, his massive frame making Lancaster shrink back. Nah, he said, his voice steady. You ruined your career. The principal stood, adjusting his tie. Effective immediately, Mr. Lancaster. You are terminated from your position at the school. Lancaster's mouth fell open. Fired. Just like that. His entire world crumbled around him as he looked between the principal and Shaq, his face burning with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, he hissed. Shaq smirked, crossing his arms. Oh, I think it is. The office door opened. Two security guards stepped inside, their expressions blank. Principal Warner gestured toward them. Please escort Mr. Lancaster off the premises. The guards moved forward. Lancaster stumbled back, his feet unsteady. You can't do this. No, Shaq said, watching as the disgraced teacher was led away, his voice calm and final. You did this. Lancaster disappears down the hallway, humiliated. But Shaq isn't done yet. He still has one final move left. As Lancaster disappeared down the hallway, his career in ruins, the tension that had gripped the school finally broke. Students murmured in disbelief, their eyes flickering between the empty space where the disgraced teacher once stood and the man who had brought him down. But Shaq wasn't done yet. He turned to Aaliyah, who still sat in the chair, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edges of the piano keys. She looked up at him, unsure of what came next. Shaq reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek white envelope, the gold trim gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He extended it toward her. This, he said, is for you. Aaliyah hesitated before taking it, her hands trembling as she carefully peeled open the flap. Her eyes widened as she pulled out the paper inside. This isn't just a scholarship, she whispered, barely able to process what she was seeing. This is a personal grant, Shaq finished for her. Enough to make sure you can follow your dreams without worrying about a thing. Aaliyah's mother, who had rushed to the school after hearing what happened, covered her mouth with both hands. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled Aaliyah into a tight hug. Oh, baby, this is life-changing. Shaq smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. No one's ever going to tell you that you don't belong again. The school bell rang, signaling the end of an unforgettable day. But as Aaliyah walked toward the stage in the auditorium, ready to accept her official scholarship, something happened that no one expected. One by one, students began to rise from their seats. Applause rippled through the room, growing louder with each passing second. Then, like a wave crashing onto shore, the entire school erupted in cheers. Aaliyah wasn't invisible anymore. She was unstoppable. Shaq grinned as he watched her take the stage. Today wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure no one like her ever got overlooked again.